Say what you will about James Beckwourth, aka Bloody Arm, but the man most definitely led a fascinating life. He may have been born a slave in Virginia, but by the time he reached adulthood, he was already trapping beaver in the Rocky Mountains, right alongside other frontier legends like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson. He spent the better part of a decade living with a Crow. He stole horses from the Mexicans, fought in wars ranging from Florida all the way to California, and spun stories so outrageous that even his own friends doubted the truth. And by the time he was well into his 60s, Beckwourth was still sitting tall in the saddle, serving as a guide for the U.S. Army during Red Cloud's War. Or at least he was until he died under very mysterious circumstances. Who was the real James Beckwourth? How's a man go from living in bondage in the Deep South to leading war parties on the Great Plains? How'd he earn the nickname Bloody Arm? And why is he now remembered more for his tall tales than his actual real-life accomplishments? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza.
Yeehaw!
James Pearson Beckwourth was born into bondage in Frederick County, Virginia, sometime around the year 1800. His father was a plantation owner by the name of Sir James Beckwourth, a nobleman of Irish and English descent who had served in the American Revolution. And his mother was an enslaved black woman whose name has since been lost to history. Now, the Beckwourth family would move to Missouri at some point when James was still a child. And by the time he reached his late teens, his daddy had set him up as a blacksmith's apprentice over in St. Louis. Details are sparse, but James would remain with the blacksmith for the next few years, before eventually getting fired after getting into an altercation with his boss. Apparently, things grew so heated that he ended up pulling a pistol. Luckily for James, that's also when his father executed a deed for emancipation. In other words, Beckwourth was granted his freedom, just in time to join one of the most legendary expeditions in all of the American West, at least in my opinion. A little something known as Ashley's 100. And at the center of it all was the fur trade, an industry that was most definitely a booming at the turn of the 19th century, mostly on account of fancy felt hats that were all the rage back east and over in Europe. The French Canadians, first began trading goods with the indigenous in exchange for pelts all the way back in the early 1600s. The practice soon spread, and over the course of the next 200 years, everyone else just sort of followed suit, including the Americans. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the subsequent Lewis and Clark expedition would only serve to open up even more territory for the burgeoning trade. So much so that by the year 1808, a guy by the name of Andrew Henry had already established a trading post on the Three Forks of the Missouri, not far from present-day Bozeman, Montana. Turned out to be a very short-lived venture, though, and thanks to increasing pressure from the locals, namely the Blackfeet, Henry and his buddies were forced to haul ass back to the settlements. Skip ahead to 1822, and that's when Henry partnered up with William Ashley and formed the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Don't worry, we're getting back to Beckwourth in just a moment, I promise. Just giving a little context. Now, up until this point, the Americans, and pretty much everyone else, had traded with the Native Americans to obtain fur, at least for the most part. And what Ashley and Henry were hoping to do was to cut out the middleman by installing their own fur trappers out west in the Rocky Mountains. So that being the case, they posted an advertisement in St. Louis, looking to hire, quote, 100 men to ascend the River Missouri to its source, there to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. And yeah, the young men who answered this call to adventure, now known as Ashley's 100, were a veritable who's who of soon-to-be famous mountain men. Guys like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, Hugh Glass, and yeah, even our own James P. Beckwourth. Eventually. You see, when James had that big fallout with the blacksmith, he fled north to the lead mines for a spell, and then south to New Orleans. As such, he wouldn't sign on with Ashley until the summer of 1824. So if you listen to that series I did on Jim Bridger, or even the episode on Hugh Glass, Beckwourth was not present during that big fight with the Rickera, nor was he there when Glass got mauled by the bear. And by the way, just an FYI, I'm not entirely sure why he changed his name from Beckwourth to Beckwourth, or even if he changed it at all. Maybe it was just a translation issue. But I will most likely be referring to him by both names throughout the course of this episode. Just didn't want to confuse anyone. Now, on the off chance that there are any new listeners who may not fully understand what I mean when I say fur trappers, it's basically what it sounds like. These guys were spending months at a time just wading in freezing rivers and creeks, or cricks as they called them, setting and baiting literal wrought iron traps for beavers. The animals were then skinned and the hide fleshed and then stretched out to dry. What resulted is what the trappers referred to as a plough or a pelt. And just to give you an idea, beaver pelts are currently, as of this recording, and to the best of my knowledge, selling for somewhere between $20 or $30 a piece. And back in 1824, in a place like St. Louis, you could sell a plough for around $8, which, adjusted for inflation, is over $250 in today's money. And really, it was just supply and demand. Like I said earlier, the beaver felt hats were in fashion among the Gentiles, so buyers were paying a premium. Thus, the adventurous young men like Beckwourth were incentivized to head out into the great unknown. It's worth noting that this was a very dangerous job. These guys just weren't on a picnic out in the forest. Once they got a little ways outside of St. Louis, there was absolutely nothing that even so much as resembled civilization. At least not civilization as they knew it. There were Mexican settlements in the Southwest as well as on the West Coast. You had a few British trappers in places like present-day Washington state. They'd also eventually raise a few outposts. There were Russians off the coast of Alaska, and of course, you had the ever-present French Canadians up north. You also had hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples, all of whom had their own unique cultures and languages and religions. The fur trappers were not the first people to see any of the various landmarks that they would end up naming or being known for. Virtually every mountain pass and every stream and every desert trail had already been discovered hundreds, if not thousands of years prior. Okay, I'm not trying to denigrate the very rich traditions of the Western tribes, nor am I attempting to whitewash their existence or even label them as quote-unquote uncivilized. All I'm trying to convey is that for the fur trappers, specifically Beckwourth and the others who joined up with Ashley, this was a brave new world. One that, while populated, had nothing in the way of conveniences they were used to back east. No doctors or judges or lawyers, no churches, no printing presses, and definitely no grocery stores. These guys were completely on their own as far as their survival was concerned. They had to hunt for every meal, they had to locate fresh water and grass for their horses, act as their own veterinarians and doctors. They had to be able to travel hundreds of miles without a map or compass, to mend their own clothing, to fix their own tools, and to occasionally stomp their own snakes. I hate that I even have to offer up these types of disclaimers, but that's what I meant when I say that the fur trappers had nothing in the way of civilization once they hit the mountains. That said, they would get quite a bit of help from the indigenous. In fact, most of your Rocky Mountain fur trappers, Beckwourth included, would eventually end up, for a lack of a better term, going native. They'd oftentimes establish their winter camps with people such as the Crow or Shoshone. They'd assimilate, intermarry, have children. Hell, they'd even participate in raids against their adopted tribe's enemies. By the time a guy like Beckwourth spent his first winter out west, he would have been almost indistinguishable from the natives, at least from a distance. Long gone were the wool or homespun clothes he had wore back in St. Louis. He would have instead been decked out from head to toe in buckskin. His hair was long and adorned by feathers, and even his boots would have been replaced by moccasins. As far as the tools of the trade, each of the trappers had what they referred to as a possibles bag. This is where they kept all the little necessities, stuff like a flint and steel for starting fires, maybe some char cloth, and all for making repairs, a pipe, tobacco, sometimes even lead balls for their firearms. And that's another thing. This was way before people had 6-shooters and repeating rifles. The long guns that the fur trappers carried were of the single-shot black powder variety. And contrary to popular belief, Hawken rifles really weren't all that popular when Ashley's men first headed west. I have no way of proving this, but just based on contemporary accounts, James Beckwourth would have most likely carried either a Kentucky or English trade rifle. He would have also had a brace of flintlock pistols, a tomahawk, several trade knives, extra lead and powder, of course, spare traps, a few blankets, maybe even a mule or two, and if he was smart, a good deal of trinkets to trade with the indigenous. And really, that's about it. That's all they had to survive in a very harsh and unforgiving environment. And although many of the Western tribes were indeed friendly, there were others who didn't much appreciate these foreign trappers encroaching on their land. So on top of being able to survive in the wilderness, Beckwourth and his companions also had to provide their own security. Not only that, but they had to figure out a way to get all that beaver fur back to the markets, as well as securing provisions for their next season. Thankfully, this problem was solved in 1825 when Ashley and Henry began using overland wagon trains to bring both the market and supplies to the mountains. Rather than the fur trappers spending months traveling back and forth to St. Louis, they would instead meet in a predetermined location out west for what they took to calling the annual rendezvous. Now, this was initially purely transactional, just a convenient way for him to sell their pelts and re-up on supplies. But in time, the rendezvous would morph into a drunken month-long party, especially once the whiskey arrived. And by the time everyone was either broke or had their fill of excitement, they'd load up and head out once again in search of that sweet, sweet beaver. Thus was the life of a Rocky Mountain fur trapper. Now, before we examine Beckwourth's various adventures, it's worth pointing out that most of what we know about the man comes from his own autobiography. And well, let's just say that these mountain men weren't exactly the best when it came to factual renditions. Truth be told, these guys were pretty legendary when it came to spinning yarns. James Beckwourth included. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that he was probably one of the worst offenders. And it's not necessarily that he was a liar, per se. I have no doubt that he stuck mostly to the truth when it mattered, like conversing with his fellow trappers or when he was serving as a guide and a scout. But as far as everyone else, it was open season, including his own biographer. So that being the case, many of Beckwourth's stories, although containing kernels of truth, are highly exaggerated. Case in point, Beckwourth claimed to have been captured by a Crow war party in 1828. According to him, he was then mistaken for the long-lost son of one of the chiefs and adopted into the tribe. Not only that, but he would then go on to become the main chief of the entire Crow nation. In all reality, Beckwourth was sent to the Crow voluntarily on behalf of his bosses at the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, just as a way to establish trade. And although he would never become the head chief, he would eventually hold a certain level of authority. All total, James would spend around 8 years with the Crow. He was privy to their councils, he joined in on their rituals and hunts, and even married a young female warrior by the name of Pine Leaf. So yeah, it's not always easy to tell where the truth ends and the fairy tales begin, especially in the 1820s. But like I said, there's always a kernel of truth in there. James Beckwourth did live with the Crow for quite a while. And he also trapped with Jim Bridger for several seasons prior to living with the Crow, during which time he had many a violent encounter with the Blackfeet. In fact, it was his prowess in battle that earned him the name of Bloody Arm. Maybe. There's also another story claiming that he earned the Bloody Arm handle by killing a huge grizzly with nothing but his bare hands. Remember what I said about tall tales. We also know that Beckwourth would occasionally make trips out west to steal horses from the rich Californios. According to historian Jerry Ensler, quote, in 1836, Pegleg Smith and Jim Beckwourth went to California with Ute Chief Walcara to steal animals from ranches and missions near Pueblo de Los Angeles. And then in 1839, they returned to carry out a huge raid in the vicinity of the mission at San Luis Obispo, midway between San Francisco and Los Angeles. They used mares in heat to lead more than 3,000 horses from the Mexican ranches, making the raid the largest livestock theft in California history. Pegleg Smith admitted, I came near going under. Them Spaniards followed us and fought us in a way the Spaniards were never known to do. End of quote. Now, this was in the late 1830s, and this was a very transitional period for the fur trappers. Not only did changes in fashion greatly decrease the demand for beaver pelts, but the animals themselves were growing more and more scarce. This, coupled with an economic depression known as the Panic of 1837, effectively meant that the mountain men had to find a new line of work, James Beckwourth included, which, in hindsight, is probably why he took to stealing livestock. Of his time in the mountains, Beckwourth would later state, I had encountered savage beasts and wild men, and what had I to show for so much wasted energy and such a catalog of ruthless deeds? By the way, this is also about the same time that his own adopted tribe, the Crow, were ravaged by smallpox, and according to some, Beckwourth was to blame. This has never been proven, but it did cause his reputation to suffer, both among the Crow and even some of his fellow fur trappers. But then again, so did stealing all those horses over in California. So, that being the case, Beckwourth returned to St. Louis in the fall of 1837, just looking for a change and hopefully a new line of work. As fate would have it, that's also when a general by the name of William Gaines was recruiting seasoned frontiersmen to head down to Florida and take on the Seminole. And for the princely sum of $50 a month, I guess Beckwourth had a hard time saying no. There was a lot going on with this conflict, what's now known as the Second Seminole War. I'm not going to get into it today. I do hope to cover the Seminole some point in the future. But this was no cakewalk, okay? By the time it was all said and done, over 15 U.S. soldiers were dead, along with a few thousand Seminole. As for Beckwourth, he ended up spending around 10 months there in the swamps, both as a mule skinner and a dispatch rider. And despite his tendency towards exaggerations, his description of the Battle of Okeechobee, hope I'm pronouncing that right, lines up almost perfectly with the historians. And once the fighting began to slow down is when Beckwourth once again became restless. Or as he put it, quote, "We had another long interval of inactivity, and I began to grow tired of Florida. I wanted excitement of some kind. The Seminoles had no horses worth stealing, or I should have certainly exercised my talents for the benefit of the United States." End of quote. So yeah, Beckwourth ended up returning to St. Louis once more in search of a job. Luckily for him, his old buddies Andrew Sublett and Louis Vasquez were looking for a steady hand at one of their posts on the Platte River. And that being the case, Beckwourth was hired on to establish trade among the neighboring Cheyenne, a tribe who just so happened to be enemies of his old friends, the Crow. And despite another trader, William Bent, warning Beckwourth that the Cheyenne would make sausage out of him, he did manage to win him over. Hell, trade was even so good that fall and winter that Vasquez was able to pay off all of his debts. Unfortunately, the success was very fleeting, and by 1840, Vasquez was forced to sell the post. But be that as it may, Beckwourth continued trading with the Cheyenne. He'd even form a trading post of his own in what's now Pueblo, Colorado. This is also when he tied the knot with a young Mexican gal by the name of Luisa Sandoval. Now, there's not a lot known about Beckwourth's various personal relationships, including this one. If I'm not mistaken, he'd get married for a third time later on. And I'm also not sure how many children he had. As far as I know, he would have at least one son with his Crow wife, they named George, but I'm not really sure when it comes to all the specifics. Now, as good as things were going there in Colorado with the Cheyenne, Beckwourth's old colleagues, Charles and William Bent, felt like he was encroaching on their territory, to the point that they actually started writing letters to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs asking for military intervention. Now, it never came of it, but this was yet another blow to Beckwourth's reputation. So once again, he pulled up stakes and headed to California. Only thing is, rather than establish trade, he instead found himself knee-deep in a revolt. Turns out just a couple of years prior, California Governor Juan Alvarado was forcibly replaced by Manuel Micheltorena. Many of Micheltorena's troops were convicts recruited from Mexican prisons, and their behavior there in California, which included a whole hell of a lot of looting and mistreatment of the locals, caused resentment among the California landowners. And by the time Beckwourth arrived in 1844, guys like Pio Pico and Jose Castro were rallying the opposition and calling for an open revolt. Now, from what I understand, once again, details are sparse, but I do think that Beckwourth aligned himself with the governor and his forces. Or at least he did until the United States declared war on Mexico in April of 1846, at which point he and some of his buddies stole around 1,800 horses and headed back to Pueblo, Colorado. Unfortunately, it was not a happy homecoming. In Beckwourth's absence, his wife Louisa had remarried. She offered to get back with him, but James instead opted to, quote, "enjoy once more the sweets of single blessedness," end quote. He'd go partners in a hotel down in Santa Fe for a while before once again signing on with the Army as a scout during the Mexican-American War. I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record at this point, but I'm honestly not too sure exactly what Beckwourth was up to during this period. There's just so many stories and contradictions that it can be very hard to keep track. There is some indication that he may have participated in the Bear Flag Revolt with Kit Carson and Fremont, but so far as I'm aware, he did not take part in the Battle of San Pasqual. And following hostilities, he remained there in California. He even took to working a mail route between Monterey and Napoma. In fact, if you've ever heard of the brutal Reed murders at Mission San Pasqual, it was Beckwourth who discovered the bodies while ferrying the mail. Now, this was a pretty grisly murder. There were 11 victims all total, including William Reed, his wife, and their 2 children, a toddler and a newborn. Beckwourth rode for help, and then he led the posse that went in pursuit of the killers, which are described in some sources as being a mix of Englishmen, Irishmen, and Americans. They managed to locate him not too far from Santa Barbara, and Beckwourth led the charge. And once the smoke cleared, the alleged murderers were dead. In the years that followed, Beckwourth did a little prospecting, especially after gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, but his main source was trading with the other miners. He had him a little post in the Sierra Valley, just west of present-day Beckwourth, California, had his own ranch, and he also discovered a mountain pass along what's now I-70. Still bears his name to this day. Matter of fact, for a brief period, the so-called Beckwourth Trail was one of the most popular routes into California. It was also there in California that he dictated his memoirs, The Life and Adventures of James P. Beckwourth, which were published in 1856. To readers back east hungry for adventure, it was pretty gripping stuff. But to historians, it's an absolute nightmare. Dates are wrong, names are mangled, and critics ended up labeling him a liar, sometimes with open racial contempt. But nevertheless, beneath all the exaggerations lay some of the richest first-hand accounts of life among the Crow. And really, this was Beckwourth's greatest contradiction. He was a man of undeniable experience, but he was discounted, mostly due to not always telling his story the way society expected. Then, of course, there's the fact that he was mixed race. For all of Beckwourth's accomplishments, many of his contemporaries viewed him as little more than a curiosity, someone to be quoted around the campfires, but not to be taken seriously in the history books. But then again, Beckwourth didn't exactly do himself any favors with all of his questionable choices, not the least of which was his participation in the Sand Creek Massacre. If you're not familiar, in 1864, a militia under the command of noted douchebag and purveyor of hate, Colonel John Shivington, attacked a friendly Cheyenne village along Sand Creek, some 140 miles east of present-day Colorado Springs. People there in the village believed themselves to be under the protection of the U.S. government. Hell, they were even flying an American flag over the camp. Didn't matter to Shivington, though. And by the time he and his men were done, somewhere between 70 and several hundred Cheyenne were slaughtered, most of whom were women, children, and the elderly. Beckwourth was there, serving as a guide and interpreter, but as to whether or not he got his hands dirty is unknown. And by the way, this is the same massacre that I discussed in the Silas Soul episode, so we definitely know that there were soldiers there who refused to take part in the killing. I'm just not sure if Beckwourth was among them. In later testimony before Congress, he claimed that he was forced to go along and that he feared for his life if he refused. And when he tried to relay what the survivors had told him, military officials cut him off, calling his words treasonous. So yeah, like I said, man, this is yet another chapter of Beckwourth's life where we really don't know who's telling the truth. And to this day, it's unclear if he was a willing participant or just a man trapped by circumstance. Either way, his reputation, say it with me, class, once again suffered. Not only was his relationship with the Cheyenne severed beyond repair, obviously, right? But even his former friends like Kit Carson condemned Shivington as a dog and his men as dirty hounds. But even so, Beckwourth continued scouting for the army, even well into his 60s. A dangerous job, to say the least, one that often demanded long and sometimes solo rides through hostile territory. Beckwourth may not have been the lean young trapper of his youth, but he did have a whole hell of a lot of experience. And just to give you an idea how formidable he still was, this is also around the same time when he came out on top in a gunfight over in Denver. So yeah, Beckwourth may have been well past his prime, but he was still a force to be reckoned with. Nothing lasts forever though, right? And whether or not we like it, time catches up with us all. So it were in late 1866 that Beckwourth's body began to fail him. He had been guiding soldiers from Fort C.F. Smith to a Crow village near the Bighorn River when he developed headaches and sudden nosebleeds. And by October, he was dead. Now to this day, nobody knows exactly what caused Beckwourth's demise. Per historian Sean Dolan, quote, according to persistent legend, Beckwourth's return to the Crow was cause for great celebration. A huge banquet was held, and the village elders recounted all the tales of bravery and valor from the glorious times when Beckwourth had been their chief, before the soldiers had come to the mountains. They asked him to become their chief once again, but he refused, graciously, explaining that he was tired and old. On the night before he was to leave, a great feast in his honor was held. The drums played and the Indians danced, and Beckwourth was fed poison. For even in death, he would be good medicine. End of quote. Now, if this is true, it doesn't really explain why the Crow would beg for him to become their leader one moment and then kill him the next. But I suppose it could have been payback for the smallpox epidemic years prior, or Sand Creek, or even just the fact that he was now working with the army. But then again, many of the Crow warriors also scouted for the army, so doesn't really make sense. There are also other stories claiming that it was the soldiers who poisoned him, mostly due to him hesitating to lead them to the Crow, which once again does not pass the smell test. This is all just speculation, by the way. There is zero evidence that Beckwourth was poisoned. Far as we know, he could have just simply been sick. Maybe he had a brain hemorrhage, I mean, that would explain the headaches and the bloody nose. Hell, it could have even been complications from a stroke, maybe an old head injury, or something as simple as high blood pressure. Either way, Beckwourth's remains were handled by the Crow. They laid him to rest per their customs and in an unknown location, somewhere in what's now Wyoming. No great monuments were raised, no town bells rang in his honor, and outside of a few frontier circles, Beckwourth's passing barely even made the papers. But love him or hate him, he was most definitely the real deal. Born into slavery and freed by his own father, Beckwourth carved out a place in a world that refused to acknowledge him. He trapped beaver with the great mountain men of the Rockies. He lived as a Crow warrior, guided immigrants across the Sierras, and fought in wars ranging from Florida swamps all the way up to Montana. Facts may blur, the dates may wobble, and the tall tales may grow taller with each new telling, but the man himself remains undeniable. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on James P. Beckwourth. Thank you so much for joining me, and until next time, adios.